The pool had been there for 7 years, and for 7 years, Marcus Chen had paid for the privilege of hatting it. Not the pool itself, Marcus loved swimming. He loved the way the morning sun caught the water when he did his laps before work. He loved how his daughter Emma, now 15, had learned to dive there when she was 8. He loved the sound of water, the resistance against his shoulders, the clarity that came in the glide from one end to the other. What he hated was the $22,000 a year it cost him to maintain. The HOA fees had started at $400 a month when he bought the house in suburban Portland in 2017. That seemed reasonable for a gated community with maintained grounds, a clubhouse, and a pool, the amenities that had sold him on the place in the first place. His ex-wife Sarah had loved the idea of a community. "It's safer," she'd said. "Emma can make friends. We can do pool parties without worrying about maintenance." That was before the divorce. That was before everything changed. By 2024, the HOA fees had nearly tripled. $730 a month. The official communiqué from the HOA board, a letter printed on cream-colored cardstock in an unnecessarily large envelope, cited ongoing structural repairs to the pool facility, updated amenities, and the ominous phrase unforeseen expenses. Marcus had attended the meetings. 3 of them each won a masterclass in bureaucratic theater. The board president, Corinne Whitmore, had sat at the head of a folding table in the community center, her reading glasses hanging from a chain, her silver hair perfectly blown out. She always wore blazers, even though the meetings were held in a room that smelled like old carpet and the desperation of people with too much time and too much authority. "The pool's pump system is from 2009, Corinne had announced at the March meeting, tapping the table with a pen for emphasis. "We're looking at a complete replacement. The filtration system is beyond code. We could have liability issues." "How much are we talking?" Marcus had asked, already knowing he wouldn't like the answer. "Initial estimates are around 40,000, Corinne said, not meeting his eyes. "After that, ongoing maintenance will need to increase by approximately $50 per household per month." $50 per month. That was $600 a year, multiplied across maybe 300 households. That was $180,000 in additional annual revenue for a pool that most of the community never used. Marcus knew this because he'd actually looked into it. He'd obtained the community usage logs, public record, Corinne had begrudgingly confirmed, and discovered that only about 40% of households used the pool with any regularity. The rest paid for the privilege of knowing it existed. Emma had stopped swimming after her mother got primary custody and moved to Sacramento. The pool became a monument to a life Marcus no longer lived. He'd mentioned this to Corinne once, after a particularly brutal meeting where she'd proposed implementing a pool optimization fee on top of the existing assessments. "You still benefit from the property value," Corinne had said, her smile thin as a credit card. "A home without amenities depreciates faster. You should thank the pool for keeping your house from becoming worthless." That was the moment Marcus had decided. It took 6 months to actually do it. 6 months of research, of hearing a contractor, of quietly gathering quotes for pool removal and the landscaping that would follow. He didn't tell anyone except his girlfriend, Lisa, who worked as a paralegal and had advised him on the legal implications. "You own the pool," she'd said, reviewing the CC and RS, covenants, conditions, and restrictions that govern the community. "I mean, technically the HOA owns it, but it's your responsibility as a resident. The question is whether they have the right to force you to maintain it, or if removal is within your rights." And Marcus had pressed. "It's murky," Lisa admitted. "Most HOAs have clauses about maintaining common areas, but a pool removal, especially on your private property, that might be defensible. You should talk to an actual lawyer, though. This could get messy." Marcus had talked to a lawyer. Jeffrey Paulson, a real estate attorney who specialized in HOA disputes, had reviewed the documents with the kind of careful attention Marcus usually reserved for the work contracts he negotiated at his own job. He'd pushed his glasses up on his nose, made a soft humming noise, and then looked at Marcus with something like respect. "It's not clean," Paulson had said, "but it's not impossible. The CC and RS state that the pool is a common amenity owned and maintained by the HOA board. However, and this is important, it also states that individual residents are responsible for the condition and appearance of their property, including maintaining any amenities located thereon. That's contradictory language, and California law tends to resolve that contradiction in favor of property owners over HOAs, especially in cases where the cost burden has become unreasonable. So I can remove it. You can try, Paulson had said. You'll need to send written notice to the board, give them a chance to respond, document everything, and honestly, be prepared for a fight. I've never met an HOA board that doesn't fight tooth and nail against losing amenities. It's about control and revenue streams. Corinne Whitmore's board especially, they're notorious in this area. Marcus had nodded, paid the consultation fee, and set the plan in motion. He'd called the contractor, a guy named Dennis who'd done work for him before, on a Tuesday morning in late July. I want it gone, Marcus had said. All of it. The pool, the deck, the equipment. I want the foundation filled in and the whole area ready for landscaping. How fast can you do it? How fast you need it? Dennis had asked. Next week. The board meets on Saturday. I want this finished before they can do anything about it. Dennis had whistled low. That's aggressive, but yeah, I can make it happen. I've got a crew. We can be there Thursday morning, have the majority of the removal done by Friday evening. Landscaping would take longer, but we can get the pool gone. It's gonna cost you, though, rush rates and all. How much? 16 grand if you want it fast, 12 if you give me 2 weeks. Marcus hadn't hesitated. Thursday morning, send me the contract. He'd told Emma the night before. She was at his place for the weekend, every other Friday through Sunday, the custody arrangement Sarah and he had negotiated when the divorce finalized 3 years ago. Emma was older now, caught in that liminal space between childhood and whatever came after. She'd spent most of the afternoon in her room, the door closed, the sound of some British crime show bleeding through the walls. Marcus had knocked, waited for her to say, "Come in," and then found her on her bed, still in her school uniform from the magnet program she attended in Sacramento. She'd looked at him with her mother's eyes, sharp, assessing, ready to be disappointed. "The pool's coming out tomorrow," he'd said. Emma had taken a beat processing. "Like you're having it drained and cleaned." "I'm having the whole thing removed, filled in. I'm turning it into a garden." She'd sat up slowly, her expression shifting from confused to something like relief. "Wait, really? Really, it's costing too much. The HOA keeps raising fees and I'm paying for something we don't use anymore. Something you don't use anymore." Emma had gotten up and hugged him, which was the thing that made him know for sure he was making the right decision. She was 15 now, she didn't hug her dad very often. But she did that night, and she held on for a long time. "Mom's going to hate this," Emma had said. "Probably," Marcus had agreed, "but it's my house, my decision. Corinne's gonna have a total meltdown." "Almost certainly," Marcus had said, "but that's her problem to solve." He'd been wrong about that last part. Corinne's meltdown would become everyone's problem, cascading outward in ways Marcus hadn't predicted, couldn't have predicted, no matter how carefully he'd planned. The destruction began at 7:45 a.m. on Thursday, July 25th, 2024. Marcus had taken a personal day from work. He'd wanted to be there to see it happen, to make it real. Dennis arrived with 3 other workers and a small excavator that they'd backed onto the property through the side gate. The morning was already hot, the California summer asserting its dominance before 9 a.m. "We'll drain it first," Dennis had explained, gesturing to the pool with the casual certainty of a man who'd destroyed many things. "Takes about 3 hours with the pump system. While that's happening, we'll start removing the deck panels. Once the pool's empty, we'll break up the concrete basin. That's where the real work is. The excavator will handle most of it, but we'll need to haul everything to the disposal site. By tomorrow afternoon, this should all be gone." Marcus had watched the pump come to life, watched the first surge of chlorinated water pour out through the hose they'd strung across the yard to the drain. 7 years of maintenance, 7 years of payments, 7 years of his ex-wife's optimism about community and safety and neighborhood connection, all of it pouring out into the street. It felt like justice. By 10 a.m., neighbors had started noticing. The first to approach was Tom Berkeley from 2 houses down, a man in his 60s who played golf and complained about everything. He'd walked right up to the fence, his face a question mark. "What's going on here?" Tom had asked. "Pool removal," Marcus had said simply. "You're removing your pool." "That's correct." "Does the HOA know?" "They will," Marcus had said. "Saturday." Tom had stared at him for a long moment, and then a slow smile had crossed his weathered face. Jesus Christ, I wish I had the balls to do that. That pool's a money pit. Are they gonna try to stop you? Probably, Marcus had admitted. Good luck with that, Tom had said, and he'd walked back to his house with a wave. By noon, the pool was empty, a yawning cavity of cracked concrete and algae stains. The power of the morning sun had turned it into something almost sinister, a mouth frozen in a scream. Dennis and his crew had made quick work of the deck panels, stacking them in a pile for removal. The smell of exposed concrete and chlorine hung heavy in the air. Marcus had gone inside for lunch, feeling oddly peaceful. The decision had been made, the action had been taken. Whatever came next would come. He'd spent a long time learning that some things were just outside his control, and once you'd made a choice, you had to live with it. Around 2 p.m., there had been a knock at his front door. Marcus had opened it to find Corinne Whitmore standing on his porch, still in her work blazer despite the heat, her face the color of a tomato that had sat in the sun too long. "What are you doing?" she demanded, her voice somehow managing to be both shrill and cold. "Hello, Corinne, how can I help you?" "You're destroying HOA property." "This is my property, Corinne. The pool is located on my lot." "It's a common amenity. You can't just remove it without board approval." Marcus had taken a breath. This was the moment everything either fell apart or became real. "Actually, I can. I'm required by law to maintain my property. The pool, as a personal liability, falls under my responsibility. I've chosen to remove that liability. It's well within my rights as a homeowner." Corinne's face had gotten even redder if that was physically possible. "You're going to hear from our lawyers." "I'm prepared for that," Marcus had said calmly. "I have my own." She'd stormed off without another word, her sensible shoes click-click-clicking on the concrete pathway. Marcus had watched her go, and then he'd gone back inside to make a phone call to Jeffrey Paulson. "She's threatening legal action," Marcus had told the lawyer. "Of course she is," Paulson had said, and for some reason he'd sounded like he was smiling. "That's what HOA boards do when they lose control. Don't worry about it. You did everything right. Send me photographs of the work. Document it all. We'll be ready." By Friday evening, the pool was completely gone. The foundation had been filled in with gravel and recycled concrete. The yard looked like a scar, raw and new, but it was undeniably no longer a pool. Dennis had quoted a price for the landscaping, sod and some trees, nothing fancy, and Marcus had approved it for the following week. Saturday morning, Marcus received an email from the HOA. It was not friendly. The subject line read, "Urgent, unauthorized removal of community asset mandatory board meeting called for 10 a.m. He forwarded it to Paulson with a note, "Here we go." Paulson's response came within 10 minutes. "Perfect. See you at the meeting. Bring everything. Don't say anything without me present." The HOA meeting convened at 10 a.m. sharp in the community center's main room. It was unusual to call a meeting on such short notice, and the turnout was smaller than normal, maybe 30 people, mostly retirees and work-from-home types who could make an emergency Saturday morning meeting. Corinne was there, of course, along with the other board members. David Chen, no relation, who worked in insurance, Patricia McAllister, a retired teacher, and Steve Morrison, who sold cars. Corinne had brought a binder, an actual physical binder, thick with documents, her fingers marking several tabs with little post-it notes. "This is highly irregular," she'd announced, banging her gavel. Yes, the board had an actual gavel, because apparently they were running a courtroom instead of managing a community. "An unauthorized removal of community property has occurred. Mr. Chen has violated the CC and RS, Chapter 3, Section 7B, which clearly states that all common amenities must be maintained by the community and cannot be altered or removed without explicit board approval." Marcus had let her finish. Paulson sat next to him, a legal pad before him, his pen poised but not writing. The lawyer had instructed him to stay silent until provoked, to let Corinne make her case. "Furthermore," Corinne had continued, her voice rising, "this removal constitutes property damage to a community asset. The pool was valued at approximately $30,000 at the time of last assessment. Mr. Chen is liable for that value, and the board is prepared to pursue both civil and legal remedies." Patricia McAllister had looked uncomfortable. David Chen had been studying his hands. Steve Morrison had looked like he wanted to be anywhere else. Then Corinne had dropped the bomb. "Additionally," she'd said, opening her binder to one of the tabs marked Assessments. "We are assessing Mr. Chen with the full cost of pool removal, which totaled $16,000, as well as an additional penalty assessment of $12,000 for unauthorized removal of community property. This will be added to his HOA account immediately. His account is now in arrears by $28,000. A murmur had rippled through the room. Furthermore, Karen had pressed on, clearly enjoying the drama of it all. In accordance with the CC and RS, Chapter 2, Section 4C, any member of the HOA with an account in arrears greater than 30 days may be subject to liens against their property. That was when Paulson had stood up. "I'm going to need to say something here," he'd announced, his tone calm but with an edge underneath it like the hum of power lines. "I'm Jeffrey Paulson, attorney for Mr. Chen. What the board has described is outside its legal authority." Karen had looked up from her binder like she'd been slapped. "Who are you?" "I just told you. I'm Mr. Chen's attorney, and I'm going to walk through why this assessment is improper, why the removal of the pool was within Mr. Chen's rights, and why any attempt to place a lien against his property would constitute a violation of California property law." He'd taken a step forward, moving to stand beside Marcus, and his whole demeanor had changed. He'd become a different person, not unkind, but absolutely certain, absolutely in control. Like someone who had argued these points 100 times before and was tired of repeating himself. First, regarding the claim that the pool is a community asset that cannot be removed. The pool is physically located on Mr. Chen's private property. While it may be classified as a common amenity for usage purposes, the responsibility for its maintenance and condition falls entirely on the property owner, as stated in Section 4A of the CC and RS, and I quote, "Individual residents are responsible for the condition and appearance of their property, including any amenities thereon." That language is explicit. A pool is an amenity. Mr. Chen is responsible for it. Therefore, Mr. Chen has the right to determine its fate. Karen had opened her mouth to interrupt. "I'm not finished," Paulson had said quietly, and Karen had closed it. Second, regarding the claim that the removal constitutes damage. A property owner removing an amenity from their own property is not property damage. It's property management. If the HOA wanted to retain ownership and control of the pool, they should have clarified that in the CC and RS by specifying that the pool is community property and not subject to removal by individual residents. They did not do this. Therefore, Mr. Chen is within his rights. Paulson had held up a finger. Third, and most importantly, regarding the assessment, California law, specifically the Civil Code sections addressing HOAs, is very clear. The cost of removing an amenity from a resident's private property cannot be levied against that resident by the HOA. The HOA does not have the authority to charge a resident for work performed at the resident's request on the resident's property. If the board wishes to dispute the removal, their remedy is civil litigation, not unilateral assessment. He'd let that settle. Furthermore, Paulson had continued, any attempt to place a lien against Mr. Chen's property based on these improper assessments would constitute what's known as a retaliatory lien, which is explicitly prohibited under California Civil Code Section 13,056. If the board pursues a lien, Mr. Chen has grounds for a civil rights lawsuit against both the HOA and the individual board members in their personal capacity. The room had gone very quiet. "Finally," Paulson had said, and his tone had become almost gentle, like he was explaining something simple to people who should have known better. "I'd suggest the board consider that it may want to consult with its own counsel before proceeding with any further action. These are strong claims. I would hate to see your members find out later that their board exposed them to personal liability." He'd sat back down. Karen had looked like she'd been hit by a truck. Her face was no longer red. It had gone pale, which somehow made her look older, more tired, less formidable. "The board will recess to consult with our attorney," she'd said stiffly. "We'll reconvene in 1 hour." The meeting had broken up. Some of the community members had actually come up to Marcus afterward and shaken his hand. Tom Berkeley had winked at him. One woman he didn't know, Patricia something, her name badge from the clipboard table had read Patricia Stevens, had said, "That was the most beautiful thing I've ever seen. We've been trying to get that board to listen to reason for 2 years. When the board had reconvened, Karen had looked like she'd been crying, though she'd reapplied her lipstick. David Chen had looked like he wanted to resign on the spot. Patricia McAllister had looked like she was already updating her resume. "The board has consulted with our legal counsel," Karen had announced, her voice stripped of all its earlier confidence. "And we've been advised that pursuing further action would be inadvisable." "What does that mean?" Marcus had asked. "It means," Paulson had said quietly from beside him, "that you've won, the assessment is dropped, there will be no lien." But as they'd left the meeting, Karen had caught Marcus at the community center door. Her face had been stripped of makeup now, and she'd looked actually human for the first time. Older, smaller, angry in a way that came from deeper than just this moment. "You think you're so smart," she'd said quietly so only Marcus could hear. "You think you've won something, but this isn't over. People like you who think the rules don't apply to them, we always find a way." "Karen," Marcus had said, and he'd meant it without malice, "I just want to live my life. I never wanted any of this." "No," she'd said, and her smile had been something dark, "but you're about to get it anyway." And then she'd walked away, and Marcus had felt for the first time a small, cold thing growing in his chest. The feeling that this wasn't actually over. The feeling that Karen Whitmore was not the kind of woman who accepted defeat. He'd been right. 3 weeks after the pool removal, the HOA sent Marcus a notice about his landscaping. The notice was dated August 14th, 2024, and it was written in the same formal, cream-colored envelope as always. But the language was new, and it was brutal. "The unfinished state of the property at 847 Silverwood Court presents a violation of community standards and architectural guidelines," the letter read. "Per Section 5C of the CC and RS, all properties must maintain acceptable grounds that reflect positively on the community. The filled-in pool foundation, covered only with gravel and recycled concrete, does not meet these standards. You are required to complete landscaping improvements, including sod installation, adequate plantings, and hardscape features, within 30 days. Failure to comply will result in a fine of $200 per day assessed against your account." Marcus had stared at the letter for a long moment, then read it again to make sure he wasn't missing something. The landscaping had been scheduled to start the following Monday. He was already planned to have the work completed within 2 weeks of that start date. The HOA had given him 30 days, which should have been more than enough. Except that 3 days later, on August 17th, before the landscaping even began, another letter arrived. This one contained an architectural review application denial notice. Apparently, Marcus needed HOA approval for the landscaping improvements. This was news to him, though he supposed if he'd read through all 500 pages of CC and RS, he might have found it in there somewhere. The application he'd apparently needed to submit required a site plan, a plant species list, specifications on all hardscape materials, drawings prepared by a licensed landscape architect, and a fee of $350. The application he'd filled out, hastily, after receiving this letter, had been rejected for insufficient detail regarding underground irrigation systems and drainage management. "These are reasonable requirements," the HOA letter stated. "We cannot approve projects that may negatively impact the community's infrastructure or aesthetic standards. Resubmit with complete specifications." That had been from Karen, naturally. She'd signed this letter herself, no longer bothering to hide behind the board president's formal language. Marcus had called Jeffrey Paulson immediately. "They're messing with you," Paulson had said, which wasn't exactly legal advice, but it was accurate. "The pool removal was a clean win for you legally. Now they're finding ways to harass you through the architectural review process. It's petty, but it's also technically within their authority. HOAs can enforce design standards." "So what do I do?" "Submit a proper application. Have the landscaper provide the details they want. Pay the fees. It sucks, and it's clearly retaliatory, but you don't have a lot of legal options here. Retaliatory action by HOAs is a gray area in California law, especially when they're technically following their own rules." "This is ridiculous," Marcus had said. "It is," Paulson had agreed. "But it's also standard HOA behavior. I'm sorry. This is what happens when you make people like Karen lose face. They find ways to win the war even if they lost the battle." The landscaper, when informed of the new requirements, had laughed. Then he'd quoted an additional $2,500 for the architectural plans and irrigation specs. "I gotta hire an actual landscape architect," Dennis had explained. "It's gonna take time, Probably another 2 weeks, and then you gotta wait for the HOA to approve it. Marcus had done the math in his head. 30 days from the original notice would be September 13th. It was now August 17th. The landscaper couldn't possibly get the detailed plans done by then, which meant Marcus would be in violation within 30 days. The fines would start at $200 a day. By the time everything was actually approved and completed, Marcus would have paid thousands in extra fees and fines. It was brilliant, actually. Evil but brilliant. And then, because apparently one shoe wasn't enough, the other dropped on August 22nd. This letter came from the county building department, not from the HOA. Marcus didn't recognize the sender initially, but the official seal on the envelope told him it was important. "This is to notify you," the letter began, "that the removal of the above-referenced pool structure at 847 Silverwood Court may have been conducted without proper permits. An inspection of the property has been requested by a community member, and we are required to investigate. A code enforcement officer will contact you within 5 business days to schedule an inspection." A code enforcement investigation. Marcus had read that sentence 4 times, trying to understand how this was possible. He'd hired a licensed contractor. Dennis had obtained the necessary permits, or so he'd claimed. Suddenly uncertain, Marcus had called Dennis immediately. "Did we get permits for the pool removal?" Marcus had asked. There had been a long pause on the other end of the line. Dennis had said, "Yeah, so about that." "What does about that mean?" "It means I may have skipped that step. Look, pool removals are generally pretty straightforward, and the permitting process in this county is a nightmare. Most contractors just do it and don't ask. In 7 years of doing removals, nobody's ever called code enforcement on me." "Until now," Marcus had said. "Yeah, until now. I'm sorry, man. I'll cover the costs of getting it properly documented retroactively. It should be fine. Worst case, we might have to do some extra work to bring it into code, but there's no illegal structure there anymore, so we might still get fined." "Possible," Dennis had admitted. Marcus had hung up and called Paulson again. "This is a problem," Paulson had said, reading the letter. "Not a huge one, but a problem. If they find code violations, they can fine you. They can also require you to bring everything into compliance. The good news is that there's nothing to bring into compliance since you've removed the pool. The bad news is that Karen clearly called the county. She's weaponizing government agencies against you." "Can she do that?" Marcus had asked. "Technically, anyone can report code violations. She's probably citing community safety or property values. It's retaliation, but proving that in a way that matters legally is difficult. All I can suggest is that you cooperate fully with the code enforcement officer, have Dennis provide documentation, and hope they find nothing wrong." The code enforcement officer, a woman named Detective Martinez, though she wasn't actually a detective. The title was just how the county worked, arrived on August 29th. She was professional and thorough, spending 2 hours photographing the removed pool area, examining the gravel and recycled concrete, checking the drainage, and asking detailed questions about permits. "I'm going to recommend a small fine," she'd told Marcus, clipboard in hand. "About $500, the lack of permit documentation, even though the work itself is fine, it should have been permitted, that's all." $500, an insignificant amount in the grand scheme of things, but the point of it, the harassment of it, the principle of it, was loud and clear. When Marcus had told Paulson, the lawyer had actually laughed. "She's running out of big weapons," Paulson had said. $500 code violations, landscaping delays, this is the sound of someone grasping at straws. I wouldn't worry too much." But Marcus was worried, because he could see the pattern now. Every move he made was going to be blocked, delayed, or turned into an excuse for more fees and fines. Karen had decided he was an enemy, and she had institutional power. The power of the HOA, the power of her position as board president, the power that came from having nothing better to do than make people's lives difficult. By mid-September, the landscaping had finally been approved. The plans showed a simple xeriscape garden, low-water shrubs, and native grasses. It was attractive and environmentally responsible. The HOA had approved it, though Karen had sent a note along with the approval that said, "We are pleased that Mr. Chen has decided to bring his property into compliance with community standards." The landscaper had got to work. By the end of September, Marcus's yard looked genuinely nice. The grass had been laid, The shrubs were planted. A small stone sitting area had been created where the pool's deep end used to be. Emma, visiting for her weekend, had actually smiled when she saw it. "It's pretty, Dad," she'd said. "Thanks," Marcus had replied, and for a moment it had felt like maybe this was over. Maybe Karen had given up. Maybe he could go back to his normal life. He'd been very, very wrong about that. On October 3rd, Marcus received a letter from the HOA containing a new assessment. Due to the unprecedented expenses associated with managing the property dispute and architectural review process, the letter read, "The board has voted to implement a special assessment of $800 from all homeowners. This is to cover legal fees, administrative time, and updated insurance evaluations." $800, on top of his regular HOA fees, on top of everything else. Marcus had read the letter 3 times, searching for a logical argument, a legal loophole, something to explain why this was wrong beyond the obvious fact that it absolutely was wrong. Paulson had been unavailable when he'd called. His secretary had taken a message. By the time Paulson had called back, Marcus had already written an email to the entire board expressing his objection in terms that probably weren't helping his cause, but that felt necessary. "The assessment is technically legal," Paulson had said when he'd called Marcus back. "It's bullshit, but it's legal. HOAs can levy special assessments for operational expenses, and legal fees for disputes involving community property could technically qualify. Is it obviously retaliation? Yes. Can I prove it in a way that matters legally? Probably not. So I have to pay it. You can try to fight it. We could file an appeal, get it in front of a judge. But that would cost you more in legal fees than the assessment itself. I hate to say this, but sometimes the right move is to just pay it and get on with your life." Marcus had paid it. By the end of October, he'd written 3 checks to the HOA that totaled $1,850. The code violation fine, the architectural review fees, the special assessment, plus his regular monthly HOA fees. It was adding up to a small fortune, all because he'd removed a pool. And then on November 1st, something changed. Marcus received a phone call from Emma's mother, Sarah, and her tone was icy in a way he'd rarely heard before. "I got a letter from the HOA," Sarah had said without preamble, "addressed to both of us as joint property owners regarding what it calls serious violations of community standards." Marcus had felt his stomach drop. "I'll read it to you," Sarah had continued, and then she'd recited the letter. "Recent actions taken by a resident of your property have resulted in violations of CC and RS sections 3A, 4C, and 5D. These violations include unauthorized removal of community assets, failure to maintain proper landscaping timelines, and general contempt for community governance. Due to the severity of these violations, the board is recommending further investigation into Mr. Marcus Chen's fitness to continue as a member of this community." "What does fitness to continue as a member mean?" Sarah had asked. "I have no idea," Marcus had lied. He had an idea. It sounded like they might be trying to move toward an eviction or forced sale. "Well, I want you to figure it out," Sarah had said, "because my name is on this property too, and I'm not having my credit destroyed because you decided to have a crisis about your HOA fees." And then she'd hung up. Marcus had called Paulson immediately. This time the lawyer had answered on the first ring. "They're trying to scare you," Paulson had said. "The language about fitness to continue is vague, which means it's probably not legally supportable. But it also means they're looking for ammunition to use against you. What you need to do is stop giving them ammunition." "What do you mean?" "I mean," Paulson had said, "that Karen is playing a long game. Every violation she can document, every fine she can levy, every agency she can weaponize, it all adds up to a picture of you as a problem resident. If she can build that case, she might be able to pursue legal action that, while not guaranteed to succeed, would be expensive and unpleasant for you to fight." "Like what?" "Like forcing a sale of the property, or eviction in extreme cases, though that's rare, or liens and foreclosure, or a lawsuit for damages to community property. I'm not saying these things would succeed, but I'm saying that the threat of them might be enough to make you sell and move away." "That's insane," Marcus had said. "That's HOAs," Paulson had replied. Winter came to Portland with the kind of gray that never seemed to end. November bled into December, and Marcus found himself in a state of cold waiting, unsure what Karen would do next, but knowing she would do something. He wasn't wrong. On December 2nd, an email arrived from Karen with the subject line, Community Standards Improvement Plan, for your immediate review. The attachment was a 4-page document that outlined what the HOA considered Marcus's violations and its recommended path toward resolution. The violations list was extensive. Unauthorized removal of community property, the pool. Failure to timely complete landscaping improvements. Possession of landscaping that did not initially meet community standards. General disruption to community peace and harmony. Contempt for board authority. The recommended path toward resolution included a written apology to the community, an additional fine of $2,000 for property value restoration, a commitment to enhanced compliance with all HOA rules going forward, a mandatory review of his property by the board every month for 6 months. Marcus had felt something break inside him when he'd read it. Not anger he could have dealt with. It was despair mixed with a kind of furious clarity. Karen wasn't trying to win. She was trying to humiliate him. She was trying to make the cost of living in this community so high in dollars and in dignity that he would simply leave. He'd called Paulson for what felt like the 100th time. "This is absolutely retaliation," Paulson had said, his voice tight. "A written apology, contempt for board authority. These are not legitimate violations. This is personal punishment, and the financial penalties are starting to look excessive. There might be a real case here for retaliatory action by the HOA, which is explicitly prohibited under California law." "What are you saying?" Marcus had asked. "I'm saying we could potentially file a counterclaim. Argue that the HOA's actions constitute wrongful retaliation for exercising your property rights. But it would be expensive, Marcus. We're talking $5,000 to $10,000 in legal fees minimum, probably more if it goes to trial. And there's no guarantee we'd win." Marcus had taken a day off work to sit with that. He'd called in and told his boss he wasn't feeling well, which was sort of true. The stress of the past 3 months had settled into his body like a permanent resident, taking up space in his chest, his shoulders, his jaw. He'd been clenching his teeth so hard that his dentist had asked him about it at his last appointment. That night, Emma called. She always called on Friday nights when she was at her mom's place in Sacramento. "How are you?" she'd asked, and the simple kindness of the question had made him want to cry. "I've been better," he'd said. "The HOA is being difficult." "Mom mentioned something about that. She said you're being stubborn about the pool thing." Marcus had laughed bitterly. "I'm being stubborn? I remove a pool from my own property, and they're charging me thousands of dollars in fines." "I know," Emma had said. "Mom said you're probably going to lose. She said these HOA things always go against individual homeowners." "Your mom said that?" "Yeah, she was talking to her boyfriend about it. She seemed almost sympathetic, which is weird for her." Maybe that was when Marcus had decided what he was going to do. Maybe it was hearing his ex-wife's sympathetic take on his situation. Or maybe it was just that he'd reached a point where he couldn't keep living in this state of reactive waiting, trying to figure out Karen's next move before she made it. Or maybe, and Marcus would later wonder if this was the true catalyst, it was because the next day, he received a letter informing him that Karen had called his employer. The letter came from his HR department, forwarded from the corporate office in Oakland, where the legal department was based. His direct manager, a woman named Christine, had asked him to stop by her office first thing Monday morning. "So I got a weird call from legal on Friday," Christine had said, once Marcus was seated in her office with the door closed. She'd looked uncomfortable. "Someone claiming to be with your HOA called and asked about your employment status, your income level, your performance history, and whether we had record of any disciplinary issues." "Karen Whitmore called here?" Marcus had asked, shocked. "Apparently. Legal said she claimed to be investigating a dispute regarding community property and needed to verify your financial stability to ensure you could pay for damages. Legal told her we couldn't discuss any of that without a court order, and then they called me to give you a heads up that this happened. It's weird. It seems like harassment, honestly." "It is harassment," Marcus had said. "I figured. I wanted you to know. And to let you know that you're one of our most valued employees, so if you need legal support or anything like that, let me know. We can talk to our legal team about whether this rises to the level of something actionable." Marcus had thanked her, but his mind had already moved past gratitude to cold calculation. Corinne had crossed a line. She'd taken the HOA dispute out of the neighborhood and into his professional life. She'd called his employer and tried to damage his employment prospects. That wasn't just retaliation, that was harassment and possibly defamation, depending on what exactly she'd said. That evening, Marcus had called Paulson with a different tone to his voice, not defeated, angry. "I think I want to fight," he'd said. "Good," Paulson had replied. "I was wondering how long you'd take to get here. Tell me what happened." Marcus had explained about the call. "That's it," Paulson had said. "That's the smoking gun. Corinne personally contacted your employer and made claims about community property disputes. That's way beyond the scope of HOA authority. That's defamation, tortious interference with employment, and potentially harassment. We have a real case now, Marcus. We have something actionable." "What do we do?" "We file a cease and desist letter. We document everything, the assessments, the fines, the landscaping harassment, the code violations she clearly requested, and now this call to your employer. We build a comprehensive picture of a pattern of retaliation. And then we send a letter to her, to the HOA board, and to the HOA's insurance company. We tell them that if this continues, we're filing a civil lawsuit against the HOA for retaliatory action and against Corinne personally for defamation and tortious interference." "Will that work?" "It might. Most HOAs back down when they realize their insurance company might not cover retaliation. And Corinne, personally, doesn't want to be sued individually. That gets expensive. I'd say there's a 70% chance they back off when they get this letter. And if they don't, then we file the lawsuit, and Marcus, we're going to win." The cease and desist letter was beautiful in its precision. Paulson had 15 years of HOA litigation experience, and it showed. The letter laid out each violation, each fine, each action Corinne had taken, with dates and amounts. It cited California law at every turn, making clear that the HOA had overstepped its authority and that Corinne had personally engaged in behavior that violated state statutes. Most importantly, it ended with this: "If Mr. Chen receives any further communications regarding the pool removal, any further fines or special assessments related to this matter, or any further contact with his employer or family members, we will immediately file a civil lawsuit against the HOA and against Ms. Whitmore individually, seeking damages for tortious interference, defamation, emotional distress, and legal costs. We will also notify the HOA's insurance provider of the retaliatory pattern." Paulson had sent the letter on December 10th via certified mail. The response came on December 12th via an email from David Chen, one of the other board members, sent directly to Marcus rather than through Corinne. "We need to talk," it had read. "Can you meet without lawyers?" Marcus had agreed, cautiously. They'd met at a coffee shop on December 13th, and David had looked like a man who'd been put through a ringer. "Corinne's lost her mind," David had said without preamble, after ordering a black coffee he clearly didn't want. "She's obsessed with you. She's been calling people, trying to build a case, spending hours on HOA business that should take minutes. The other board members think she's gone too far. Patricia wants to call an emergency board meeting and vote on removing her as president." "Why are you telling me this?" Marcus had asked. "Because it needs to stop," David had said. "Because you're right and we all know it. Because Corinne's making the whole board look bad. I can't speak for the whole board yet, but I can tell you that when it comes to the question of whether the HOA backs down, I'm voting yes. And I can probably get Patricia to vote with me. That's 3 votes. Corinne's the only one who wants to keep fighting, and even Steve seems tired of it." "What about the special assessments, the fines?" Marcus had asked. "I think we drop all of them," David had said. "I think we tell you we were wrong and we move forward. It's not a perfect solution, but it stops this from becoming a lawsuit. And Marcus, nobody wants that. A lawsuit would destroy this community. Legal bills would destroy the HOA budget. Your lawyers would probably find a lot of things the board didn't do right over the years. It's not a fight anyone wins." The emergency board meeting had been called for December 18th. Marcus wasn't invited, but Paulson said he could attend as legal counsel for the plaintiff in the potential lawsuit. They'd both shown up, and Corinne's face when she'd seen them had been something to remember. What followed had been 45 minutes of tense conversation among board members, with Marcus and Paulson sitting in the back like observers at someone else's life. Patricia had made the motion. I move that we reverse all fines and special assessments levied against Mr. Chen, effective immediately. I move that we formally apologize for the manner in which the pool removal dispute was handled. And I move that we release Mr. Chen from any further liability related to the pool removal. David had seconded it. Steve Morrison had voted yes without comment. Karen had voted no. Patricia had looked at her with something like pity. "It's 3-1, Patricia had said quietly. "The motion passes. Karen, we're going to need to have a separate discussion about your role on the board." Karen had stood up so fast her chair had fallen backward. "This is a betrayal," she'd said, her voice shaking. "A betrayal of everything we've built in this community." "What we built," Patricia had said, also standing, "was getting out of hand. What you built was a vendetta. Those aren't the same thing." Karen had gathered her things, slowly, deliberately, like she was leaving every ounce of dignity behind, and she'd walked out. She hadn't looked at Marcus, she'd just left. By the following week, the board had voted again. This time it was to ask Karen to step down as board president. She'd refused at first, but once the HOA's insurance company had made clear that continued retaliation would void her coverage, she'd agreed to resign entirely. The special assessments had been reversed. The fines had been dropped. The HOA had sent Marcus a formal letter of apology, written by David Chen, that credited a misunderstanding regarding property rights and board authority. And Marcus's life had gone back to something resembling normal, except for one important thing: the broken trust. The realization that the community he'd thought was safe and stable had revealed itself to be fragile and vulnerable to the whims of a single person who decided he was an enemy. By January, with Karen gone, everything should have felt better. And for about 3 weeks it did. Then, on January 21st, Marcus received a knock on his door. He opened it to find Karen standing there, and his first instinct was to close it immediately. But Karen held up her hands in a gesture that was supposed to be peaceful, but looked mostly defensive. "I'm not here to cause trouble," Karen had said. I wanted to apologize in person. I owe you that." Marcus had considered not letting her in, but somewhere deep in him, some place he hadn't quite learned to seal off, there was a sliver of curiosity about what she might say. He'd let her in, but only as far as the living room. They hadn't sat. It had felt too intimate for sitting. "I handled everything wrong," Karen had said, and she'd looked genuinely defeated, smaller somehow, less formidable. "I thought I was protecting the community. I thought you were being disrespectful, but I was. I was out of control. I know that now. I've been going to therapy about it, about my need to control things and my inability to accept when people don't fall in line with what I think is right." "Okay," Marcus had said, because he wasn't sure what else to say. "I'm selling my house," Karen had continued. "Moving to a smaller place, no HOA. I'm taking some time off from community board positions. I think I need to sort myself out before I take on any more responsibilities." "I'm glad you're recognizing that," Marcus had said, and he'd meant it. Not for her sake particularly, but for everyone else in the community who would be spared her particular brand of governance. "I also wanted to let you know that I went to Jennifer at the county code office and explained that I'd filed a complaint about your pool removal that might not have been entirely motivated by legitimate safety concerns. She's clearing the violation from your record. You won't have to pay that $500 fine." "I appreciate that," Marcus had said. "I hope someday you can forgive me," Karen had said, and she'd looked like she genuinely meant it, or at least like she wanted to mean it. "I'm not sure I'm there yet," Marcus had replied honestly, "but I think I might get there eventually." Karen had nodded, and then she'd left, and Marcus had stood in his living room for a long time afterward, trying to process what had just happened. Emma, visiting that weekend, had asked about the expression on his face. "Karen Whitmore came by," he'd said. "The evil HOA lady?" Emma had asked. "The same," she apologized. "Do you believe her?" Marcus had considered the question carefully. "I think she believes she's apologizing. Whether that's genuine remorse or just self-preservation, I'm not sure yet. Ask me again in a year." By spring, the community had settled into a new rhythm. Patricia McAllister had taken over as board president, and her first act had been to propose a review of all HOA fees and a restructuring of the special assessments. She'd actually asked residents what they wanted from the HOA, rather than telling them. The result had been a modest decrease in fees for everyone. The pool remained gone. Dennis had eventually finished the landscaping, and it had grown in beautifully. The sitting area where the deep end used to be had become a favorite spot for Marcus to read on weekend mornings. Emma had said it was actually kinda peaceful when she visited. And Marcus had eventually stopped clenching his jaw so hard. But something had changed in him, subtly, permanently. He'd learned that communities could turn on you. He'd learned that one person's obsession could poison everything. He'd learned that sometimes winning meant just surviving, and that the cost of victory could be higher than you'd anticipated paying. 3 months after Karen had moved, Marcus had run into Patricia at the grocery store. "How are you doing?" Patricia had asked, and she'd seemed to genuinely care. "Better," Marcus had said. "I'm doing better." "Karen's buying a condo over in Lake Oswego," Patricia had said. "I ran into her last week. She seems like she's in a better place." "That's good," Marcus had said, and he'd meant it. He was tired of being angry. "Thank you," Patricia had added, "for not destroying us all with a lawsuit." "Your insurance company asked nicely," Marcus had replied. They'd laughed, and it had felt like release. By the time summer arrived again, exactly 1 year after Marcus had removed the pool, the community had transformed in ways that had nothing to do with the physical landscape. The HOA meetings had become shorter, more efficient. Patricia had instituted a policy where each agenda item had a time limit. No more hours-long debates about whether the welcome sign needed repainting. Just decisions, communicated clearly, and then moving on. The community felt less like a dictatorship and more like, well, an actual community. But the real change had been in the residents themselves. The pool removal had become a kind of turning point. It was the moment when people had realized that the board wasn't infallible. It was the moment when, collectively, the community had decided that maybe they didn't have to accept everything handed down from above. Change had followed in small ways. A proposal to reduce meeting frequency from monthly to quarterly, a decision to open board meetings to actual input from residents, a suggestion to implement an appeals process for any fines or violations. Karen's influence, once she'd left, had been like water evaporating. Within months, it was hard to remember why anyone had been so afraid of her. But for Marcus, the internal landscape had taken longer to change. He'd gone back to therapy for a while, not because anything was catastrophically wrong, but because the experience had shaken something in him. He'd spent a lot of his adult life trying to get along, trying not to make waves. The pool situation had forced him to learn something new, that sometimes making waves was necessary, that sometimes standing your ground cost money and time and emotional energy, but the alternative, backing down, accepting harassment, cost something too. Maybe something more important. Lisa, his girlfriend, had noticed the shift in him. "You're different," she'd said one afternoon in July as they'd sat by a pool. A different pool, a public one, where Marcus could rent time by the hour and didn't have to pay board members for the privilege. "Different how?" Marcus had asked. "More solid," Lisa had said. "Like you decided something, like you stopped questioning whether you had the right to do what you did." "I did have the right," Marcus had said, "but it took a while to internalize that." "You do now?" Lisa had asked. "Yeah," Marcus had said, "I do." By autumn, Marcus had decided to take a step he probably should have taken months earlier. He'd reached out to Jeffrey Paulson and asked if there were any ongoing matters or if the case was truly closed. "It's closed," Paulson had said. "Karen's moved on. The HOA backed down completely. There's nothing left to litigate." "What would have happened," Marcus had asked, "if they hadn't backed down?" "We would have filed," Paulson had said. "We would have had a solid case for retaliatory action. We probably would have one. It would have been expensive and time-consuming, but we would have one." "How much would we have been awarded?" "Hard to say. 50,000? 100? The actual damages aren't that high. We're talking a few thousand in fines that they shouldn't have assessed. But when you add in legal fees, emotional distress, business interference, and the deterrent factor of preventing future retaliation, a jury could have gone high. Especially after we presented evidence of the call to your employer. That was bad for them. That was the thing that guaranteed we'd win." Marcus had considered this. The idea that Karen had actually handed him the weapon that would have destroyed her if it had come to that. She'd overreached. She'd gone too far. And in going too far, she'd made her retaliation undeniable. That fall, Emma had moved into the house for the first time in a long while. Sarah had offered, "Your father seems stable, and you keep complaining about your mom's boyfriend anyway," and Emma had accepted. She was heading to college in the fall, UC Davis, double major in environmental science and economics, but she wanted to spend her senior year with her dad. "Will Karen come back?" Emma had asked once, while they were sitting on the back patio, looking at the garden that had replaced the pool. "I don't think so," Marcus had said. "She's gone, new house, new community, no HOA. "Do you think she's happy?" Emma had asked. Marcus had considered this carefully. "I think she's trying to be. I think she's doing work to understand why she acted the way she acted. I think she might actually become a better person because of what happened, which would be ironic given that she caused it all." "That's very forgiving of you," Emma had said. "Maybe," Marcus had said, "or maybe I'm just tired. Anger takes a lot of energy." That winter, the HOA sent out a community survey asking residents what they valued about the neighborhood and what they wanted to change. The responses were surprisingly thoughtful. People wanted more community events. People wanted faster response times on maintenance issues. People wanted transparency in HOA finances. Nobody mentioned anything about pools or amenities or Karen Whitmore. By spring of the following year, 2 years after the pool removal, Marcus had sold the house. It wasn't because of the HOA or the aftermath of the conflict. It was because Lisa had gotten a job offer in San Francisco that was too good to turn down, and Marcus had realized that he was ready for a change. Emma was off at college by then, thriving in her environmental science program. Sarah had moved on with her life, and Marcus had decided that sometimes the right thing to do was to let go of the place where the conflict had happened and build something new somewhere else. The new owners of the house were a young couple with 2 kids. The real estate agent had mentioned that the new owners were specifically drawn to the beautiful garden space and the recently updated landscaping. They'd complimented the work that had been done and expressed enthusiasm about the property. Nobody had asked about the pool. Marcus and Lisa had found a small house in the hills outside of Berkeley, in a planned community that didn't have an HOA. It was smaller than Marcus's Portland home, and the view was spectacular. They'd spent their first summer there almost every evening on the back deck, watching the light change across the bay. "No regrets?" Lisa had asked once. "About moving?" "About all of it. The pool removal, the fight with the HOA, the whole thing." Marcus had thought about this. He'd thought about the stress, the money spent on legal fees, the months of harassment. He'd thought about Karen and her obsession, and the way she'd made his life smaller and more difficult simply because she could. But he'd also thought about the moment when he'd realized he had the right to stand his ground. The moment when he'd decided that the cost of living under someone else's tyranny was higher than the cost of fighting back. The moment when he'd learned something about himself that he'd needed to learn. "No regrets," he'd said finally. "Not about any of it. I wouldn't choose to do it again, but I wouldn't undo it either." "That's very zen of you," Lisa had said. "I've had a lot of time to think about it," Marcus had replied. 3 years after the pool removal, Marcus ran into Tom Berkeley at an airport. Tom was heading to Phoenix for his annual golf trip. Marcus was heading back to Portland for Emma's college graduation ceremony. They'd recognized each other in the security line and had grabbed coffee before boarding. "How's the HOA treating you?" Tom had asked, in the way people ask questions about things they know are fraught. "I'm not there anymore," Marcus had said. "Sold the place, living in the Bay Area now." "Smart move," Tom had said. "After all that Karen nonsense, I would have left too." "How is she?" Marcus had asked, surprising himself with the question. He hadn't thought about Karen in months. "Gone," Tom had said. "Moved to Lake Oswego like Patricia said, but she didn't stay there long. Some health stuff, I think. Moved to be closer to her daughter in Portland, actually. I see her sometimes around town. She looks smaller, quieter." Marcus had wondered if she'd ever told her daughter about what had happened. If she'd framed it as a learning experience or if she'd tried to justify it. If she'd eventually forgiven herself. "Patricia's still running the board," Tom had continued. "And let me tell you, the difference is night and day. HOA fees actually went down last year. Down. I didn't know that was possible. And there's actually going to be community events now, movie night in summer, a block party in the spring. It's like the neighborhood came alive again once Karen wasn't sucking all the oxygen out of the room." Marcus had smiled at this description, and then they'd boarded their planes in different directions. At Emma's graduation, Sarah had been there, with her new boyfriend, who seemed nice enough and had the sense to stay mostly out of conversations between Marcus and Sarah. Emma had walked across the stage to receive her degree, and both parents had felt something like pride settling in their chests at the same time. For just a moment, they'd been on the same team again. "How are you?" Sarah had asked, sitting next to Marcus at the reception after the ceremony. "Good," Marcus had said. "Really good, actually. It's been a while." "Since the whole HOA thing?" Sarah had said. It wasn't a question. "Yeah, since then." "I talked to Patricia McAllister at the grocery store a while back," Sarah had said. "She told me what happened, the call to your employer, Karen, trying to destroy your professional reputation. I wanted to apologize for being skeptical of you when it was going on. I thought you were being dramatic." "You didn't know," Marcus had said. "I didn't even tell you half of it, and you had Emma to think about. You made the right choice for her." "I could have been more supportive," Sarah had said. "I'm sorry about that." It had been a small moment of connection between two people who'd once loved each other and had decided they couldn't anymore. It hadn't fixed anything that was broken, but it had acknowledged that they'd both been doing the best they could with the information and capacity they'd had at the time. Emma had joined them, triumphant in her graduation gown, and the three of them had stood together for a photo. It was the first time in years that they'd done this. Later, Emma had pulled Marcus aside. "Mom's actually pretty cool when she's not being defensive," Emma had said. "She is," Marcus had agreed. "I forgot that sometimes." "Are you ever going to get back together with her?" Emma had asked, with the kind of hopeful directness only a 19-year-old can muster. "No," Marcus had said gently, "but we're finding our way to being friends again. That's probably better than it was." "Okay," Emma had said, "as long as you're both happy." "We are," Marcus had said. "We're both happy." And it had been true. That fall, Marcus had received an unexpected letter. No return address, but he'd recognized the handwriting immediately. It was Karen's. He'd almost thrown it away unopened, but Lisa had insisted he read it. The letter was 3 pages long, written on the same cream-colored cardstock that the HOA used for official communications. But this time it felt intimate, personal. "I don't expect you to respond to this," Karen had written. "In fact, I'm hoping you might not want to. But I felt like I needed to explain myself, even though I'm not sure there's any explanation that would justify my behavior. I've been seeing a therapist for 3 years now. We've talked a lot about control, and about how I use authority as a way to manage my own anxiety. About how I'd taken on the role of HOA board president as a kind of project, something I could control and manage in ways that the rest of my life felt uncontrollable. When you removed the pool, it felt like you were attacking my ability to manage the community. It felt personal, even though it wasn't. I handled it badly. I handled it terribly. I made choices that were designed to hurt you, and I made those choices from a place of fear. I was afraid you were going to expose me as someone who didn't know what she was doing. I was afraid other residents would realize I'd overstepped. I was afraid of losing the identity I'd built around being the person in charge. My daughter has been very clear about the fact that she's ashamed of my behavior. She showed me some of the social media posts about the HOA situation. Apparently it got around, and I was not portrayed kindly. She said I'd spent so much energy trying to control my community that I'd forgotten how to be a good person. She was right. I'm telling you this not because I want forgiveness, though I would accept it if offered. I'm telling you this because I've come to understand that the things I did weren't just about you. They were about a pattern of behavior that had been building for years. You were just the catalyst. You were the person who finally said no to me, and I didn't know how to handle that. I'm not on any HOA boards anymore. I've stepped back from most volunteer positions. I'm focusing on being a better daughter, a better neighbor, and a better person. I don't know if I'll ever get there, but I'm trying. If you're ever back in Portland, I won't approach you. I wouldn't want to disturb your peace. But I wanted you to know that your decision to stand your ground, even though it was terrible and difficult and cost us both something, it's changed me. It's forced me to become someone different than I was. I'm not sure if you'll consider that a good thing or a mixed consequence, but I wanted you to know anyway. I'm sorry, Marcus, I genuinely am. It was signed simply Karen. Marcus had read the letter 3 times, and on the 3rd reading he'd felt something release in his chest. Not forgiveness exactly, but an acceptance of Karen as a human being capable of change, capable of recognizing her own damage, capable of trying to do better. "You should write her back," Lisa had said. "I don't know what I'd say," Marcus had replied. "You could say that you accept her apology, that you've moved on, that you wish her well. Any of those things would matter to her." So Marcus had sat down and written a short letter in return. "Corinne, thank you for your letter. I want you to know that I accept your apology, not because I think it erases what happened, but because I believe you when you say you're working to change. We all have patterns we're trying to break. I'm not going to lie and say the experience didn't hurt. It did. It cost me money, time, and peace of mind. But I also think it was important. I think I needed to learn something about standing my ground, and I needed to learn that communities can be fragile and vulnerable and can turn on you in unexpected ways. I'm genuinely glad you're doing the work to understand yourself better. The world probably needs more people who are willing to look at their own behavior and acknowledge when they've gotten it wrong. I'm not in Portland often these days, but the next time I am, I'll think of you and hope that you're finding peace in whatever comes next. Sincerely, Marcus." He'd put it in the mail before he could second-guess himself. 5 years after the pool removal, Marcus and Lisa got married. Emma was there, home from graduate school. She was getting her master's in environmental policy, which had brought him so much pride that he'd had to excuse himself to cry in the bathroom. Sarah was there too, and she'd made a small speech that mentioned Marcus's ability to stand up for himself and how much she'd always admired that about him, even when they were married. The ceremony was in the Berkeley Hills, with a view of the bay that reminded Marcus why they'd chosen this place. Lisa's parents were there, her colleagues from work, friends from the neighborhood. It was smaller than a lot of weddings, but it felt intentional. It felt chosen. During the reception, Emma had pulled out her phone and showed him something. It was an article in a Portland lifestyle magazine. The title was "How HOA Abuse Affected One Community and How One Resident's Stand Changed Everything." The article was a deep dive into the changes that had occurred in Marcus's old community after the pool removal. It highlighted Patricia's reforms, the community members who'd been emboldened to speak up about other issues, and the way that a single act of resistance had shifted the entire culture. There was even a quote from Patricia. "What Marcus did was important because it forced us all to ask whether we were a community that accepted whatever people in power told us to do, or if we were a community that could think for ourselves and push back when something felt wrong." Corinne wasn't mentioned in the article. "Did you know about this?" Marcus had asked Emma. "I reached out to the journalist," Emma had said. "I thought the story deserved to be told. The pool removal was kind of a turning point for everyone in that community, not just for you. I thought people should know about it." Marcus had felt something complex settle in his chest. Gratitude, maybe, mixed with a kind of bittersweet recognition that the thing he'd done with such personal motivation had rippled out in ways he'd never anticipated. He'd wanted to remove a pool from his yard. He'd ended up being part of changing a community's relationship with authority. That fall, Marcus had received a friend request on Facebook. It was from Patricia McAllister. "I wanted to reach out," her message had read. "I'm retiring from the HOA board at the end of the year. I wanted to thank you again for everything. The changes that happened after you stood up to Corinne, they're the best thing that's happened to this community in a long time. I know it wasn't what you intended, but I wanted you to know what a difference it's made." Marcus had accepted the request, and they'd exchanged emails a few times. Patricia was planning to travel. She'd always wanted to see Europe, she'd said. Her daughter was taking over her home in Portland. She seemed genuinely happy. One email from Patricia had contained an update about the community. "The HOA fees have gone down another 15% this year. We're actually managing to provide better services with less money because we're being more thoughtful about how we spend it. We also implemented a suggestion system where any community member can propose changes, and we actually implement them if they make sense. The culture has completely shifted. Thank you again." By that winter, Marcus had stopped thinking about Corinne in a personal way. He'd moved on from the experience in a way that felt complete. He could think about her without anger or resentment. He could understand that she'd been a person trapped in a limited identity, and that sometimes people needed to learn hard lessons before they could change. But he did think about her, occasionally, when he was reading about HOA disputes or community governance or power dynamics in small groups. He thought about the psychology of control and how people who needed to control things were often afraid of being discovered as frauds. He thought about how communities could enable and support the people who were harming them, simply by accepting the status quo. On the 10th-year anniversary of the pool removal, a date that had no particular significance except in Marcus's own timeline, he found himself thinking about writing something about the experience. Not a letter, but an actual account of what had happened. A story, told clearly, about what it cost to stand your ground and what it bought. He had started writing, sitting at the desk in his home office in Berkeley, when an email had arrived from an address he didn't recognize. The subject line read, "You might want to know this." It was from a journalist, someone who'd covered the original pool removal story and written a follow-up piece 10 years later. The email said, "I'm writing an article about how that HOA situation affected everyone involved now that we have a decade of perspective. I'd love to interview you if you're willing." Marcus had replied, "I'm interested, but I want to know what you found out about the others involved." The journalist's response had been thorough. Patricia had retired and was living in France with her partner. David Chen had moved to Seattle and was now on a city planning board. Steve Morrison had retired early and was traveling. And Karen had moved back to Portland to help care for her aging mother. She wasn't on any boards. She was working part-time in administration at a hospital. She seemed quiet, the journalist had said, less visible than she'd been before. "She's been through a lot," the journalist had written. "I think the experience changed her more than it changed anyone else involved." Marcus had considered this. The idea that the person who'd caused all the chaos might be the one most transformed by it. There was something karmic in that, though Marcus had stopped believing in karma years ago. Still, there was a kind of poetic justice in the idea that action had consequences that touched everyone involved, but especially the person who'd initiated the conflict. He'd agreed to the interview, and when the journalist had come to Berkeley to meet with him, they'd spent 3 hours talking about the experience. About what it meant to stand up for yourself when everyone else was following the status quo. About the cost of doing so and what that cost had purchased. Looking back, the journalist had asked, "Do you think it was worth it?" Marcus had thought about this carefully. He'd thought about the money he'd spent on legal fees. He'd thought about the stress. He'd thought about the fear and anger. He'd thought about the way it had taught him something about himself that he'd needed to learn. "Yes," he'd said finally, "it was worth it. Not because I'm happy it happened, I'd rather it hadn't, but because I learned that I was capable of standing my ground even when it was unpopular and difficult and expensive. I learned that communities are fragile and can be held hostage by a single person's need for control. I learned that sometimes pushing back is necessary, even if it's scary. And I learned that change is possible if you're willing to be the first one to stop accepting the status quo." The article had run 6 months later in a national magazine. It was titled, "The Pool That Changed Everything: One Man's Stand Against HOA Corruption and What Happened After." It was a well-written, thoughtful piece that examined the ripple effects of single acts of resistance. Karen had apparently read it. At least, that was what Marcus inferred when he received a final letter from her, 5 years after her previous one. "I read the article," it began. "I wasn't entirely surprised by the way you framed the events, and I'm not going to defend myself again. I think I've done enough of that. But I wanted to tell you that seeing my name in that context, as an example of what happens when someone is driven by a need for control rather than genuine community care, it was painful. But I think I needed to feel that pain. I needed to understand what I'd done, clearly and publicly, without being able to hide behind my justifications. I'm 62 now. I'm helping my mother who has Alzheimer's. I'm learning what it means to let go of control, quite literally. You can't control someone with Alzheimer's. You can only show up and do your best to love them. It's the most humbling thing that's ever happened to me. I think if I could go back, I would do things differently, but I can't, so I'm just trying to be better now than I was then. Thank you for writing about what happened in a way that was fair, even when you had every reason not to be." Karen. This time, Marcus didn't write back. He thought about it, but he decided that some conversations were complete. Some relationships had said everything they needed to say, and anything more would be unnecessary. Instead, he'd filed the letter away, and he'd let it be the end of the story. 20 years after the pool removal, a milestone that Marcus actually did remember this time. He'd been invited back to Portland to speak at a municipal government conference about community governance and the importance of transparent, accountable leadership. The irony wasn't lost on him. He'd declined the speaking engagement, but he'd visited Portland for a long weekend anyway. He'd driven past his old house, which now belonged to the young couple who'd bought it from him. It looked well-maintained. The garden had matured beautifully. There was a small playset in the backyard. The couple had had 2 more children since buying the property. He'd run into Patricia at a coffee shop, and they'd had coffee together. Patricia was 83 now, but still sharp, still engaged with the world. She'd told him about the community, how it had continued to evolve, how the HOA had actually become a model for other communities in the area who wanted to implement more democratic processes. "It all traces back to you," Patricia had said, "to your willingness to say no." "I didn't do it to change the community," Marcus had pointed out. "I did it because I was tired of being charged $22,000 a year for a pool I wasn't using." "I know," Patricia had smiled, "but that's often how real change happens. Someone does something for a personal reason, and it turns into something bigger than themselves." Before leaving Portland, Marcus had decided to do something he hadn't planned. He'd driven to Lake Oswego, where Karen had moved after the HOA situation. He'd looked up her address. He wasn't stalking her, he'd told himself, just curious, and had driven past her house. It was a small, modest condo in a quiet area. There was no HOA, no sign of Karen in the yard or on the street. He'd almost kept driving, but something had made him park the car and write a note. "Karen," he'd written on a piece of paper from his notebook, "I'm in Portland for the weekend, and I found myself thinking about you. I wanted to let you know that I've made peace with everything that happened. I hope you have too. Take care of yourself." He'd left it in her mailbox, and then he'd driven away without waiting to see if she would come outside. He never found out if she'd read it. He never heard from her again. But that was okay. Some stories didn't need closure. Some conversations ended in silence, and that silence could be enough. Marcus had driven back to the coast, where Lisa was waiting at a hotel overlooking the Pacific. They'd spent the evening watching the sunset and talking about their lives, how they'd built a good one together, how the past had shaped them but didn't define them, how gratitude mattered more as you got older. "No regrets?" Lisa had asked, just like she'd asked years before. "No regrets," Marcus had confirmed. And he'd meant it with his whole heart.